Hello! Today's story is called Crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Our learning objectives today are to describe the challenges of crossing the Appalachian Mountains, describe Daniel Boone's adventures as a trailblazer, demonstrate an understanding of the word pioneers, and then use a graphic organizer to analyze the actions of Daniel Boone. Today's key vocabulary are passes, pioneers, trailblazer, and wilderness. Passes. Passes are natural gaps between mountains. They used the passes to cross the mountains because it was quicker than climbing all the way up to get to the other side. Pioneers. Pioneers were the first people to live in a new place. The girl and her brother pretended they were pioneers in outer space. Trailblazer. A trailblazer is a person who creates a trail leading the way for others to follow. Wilderness. Wilderness is an area of land with many wild plants and animals and few people living there. When the woodsmen went out into the wilderness, they saw plants that they had never seen before. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of review. We're going to make a compass. Remember, a compass has 4 main points. These are called cardinal directions. We've got north, east, south, and west. Okay? The word cardinal means basic and most important. So north, south, east, and west are the most important directions used to describe a location on a map. How do you remember north, south, east, and west? I know friends in my class have watched the Go Noodle Never Eat Soggy Waffles, and they love that one. And that helps us remember never, which is north, eat, which is east, soggy, which is south, and waffles, which is west. Okay. Last time we learned about Daniel Boone, I want you to describe him. Tell me a little bit about Daniel Boone. He was adventurous, he was a good hunter, he was a good woodsman, and he wanted to go where? Across the Appalachian Mountains on the other side, right? Why was it difficult to cross the Appalachian Mountains? Because there are a lot of woods and it's not very easy to get through them. There aren't really any paths. Okay. What 2 words do you hear in the word trailblazer? Trail and blaze. Blaze can mean a fire, but in this case it means to lead and create. A trailblazer is someone who creates a trail leading the way. A trailblazer is a type of explorer. Trailblazers don't just explore, they also make trails in the area that they go so that other people can go the same way that they went. Daniel Boone is one of the most famous trailblazers. Our key vocabulary, remember we've got passes, pioneers, trailblazer, and wilderness. I want you to listen carefully to find out what happened during Daniel Boone's adventures as a trailblazer. Daniel Boone continued to explore the Appalachian Mountains, always on the lookout for a path that might lead him to the other side. One day, he was visited by an old friend, John Finley. As the 2 men talked, Daniel told John of his desire to find a way to cross the mountains. To his great surprise, Finley replied, "Why, I know a way. I've crossed the Appalachians myself." He told Daniel that he knew of several big gaps in the mountains. A gap is a space between 2 things. Okay. Formed by rushing water years ago, the natural gaps, or passes, through the mountains had been trampled down first by buffalo and later by Native Americans. Passes make it easier to cross mountains than climbing straight up to get to the other side. One pass was not too far from where Daniel Boone and his family lived. It's in Virginia. It's called the Cumberland Gap. Finley told him, "It is an old Native American footpath. Boone was delighted. He asked John Finley to show him how to find it. Okay, I've got Quinn right here, and I've got Emmy right here, and both of them are needing my attention. Not long after that, the two men set off with 4 other men on a big adventure to find the Cumberland Gap. They walked and rode on horseback for many miles before reaching the beaten path that led up a steep side of the mountain. They spent long days climbing up and up and up. Daniel's skills as a woodman helped them identify animal tracks and follow the Native American footpath. They were overjoyed to reach the top of the mountain, where they could see a magnificent river stretching out beneath them. Following a narrow footpath, the men finally made it to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, to the land that is now known as Kentucky. So, Kentucky is located west of the Appalachian Mountains, which means that Daniel Boone made it to the other side of those mountains. Daniel and his friends were pleased with what they found on the other side of the mountains. The land was rich and fertile, and there were great herds of buffalo grazing on grasses. For the next 2 years, Daniel Boone stayed in eastern Kentucky hunting and trapping wild animals. So he was trapping those animals for clothes and for food. Okay. When he finally returned to North Carolina, he was met by other settlers who expressed an interest in leaving their homes in the east and moving westward. These pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. It's not an easy trip, Daniel Boone told them. The forests are dense, and there are many dangers along the trail. But the pioneering spirit of these settlers remained strong. Oh my goodness. 2 years later, they convinced Daniel that they were serious about making the hard and dangerous trip to the lands in the wilderness. Excuse me. And so Daniel led his own family, along with several other families, back through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. However, the trip proved even harder for families than it had been for the woodsmen. The families were not used to living in the wild outdoors like the woodsmen. Setting up a settlement in Kentucky was more difficult than the pioneers expected, and they were forced to go back home over the Appalachian Mountains. So they all traveled all the way out there, but it was too hard for those families, so they went back. Later, a businessman offered Daniel Boone a job to help widen some of the Native American trails that cross the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted Daniel to make the trails wider and clearly marked so that pioneers would not lose their way as they crossed the mountains. Daniel Boone became known as a trailblazer. He helped to open up the way for pioneers to move west. Daniel Boone gathered together a group of men to help him clear the forest through the wilderness. Together, they worked through rain, snow, and mud. They used axes to chop down trees and bushes to widen the old Native American footpath so that the pioneers' wagons would fit. Remember, a footpath is only wide enough for walking or riding a horse. A footpath is not wide enough for wagons. They built log bridges across streams. Daniel Boone and the men successfully cleared a trail from eastern Virginia through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky. The trail was originally Native American footpaths called the Great Warrior's Path. Later, it became known as the Wilderness Road. Pioneers from Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania began to move along the Wilderness Road in great numbers. By the time that Kentucky was declared a state, less than 20 years after the trail was widened, more than 100,000 people had used the Wilderness Road. Daniel Boone's hard work was responsible for opening up the area known as the West to many pioneers. As more and more settlers streamed into the West, relationships with Native Americans who were already living there became even more strained. Why do you think the Native Americans would be unhappy? Because they were getting pushed out of their home, right? Daniel Boone's own family was the first pioneer family to settle in Kentucky. Daniel chose a spot near the Kentucky River to build a fort. It took several years to complete the fort. About as large as one city block, the fort sheltered log cabins and the people that lived in them. The fort was named Boonsboro after Daniel Boone, the man who had built it. Life was difficult for the pioneers in the beginning, but people kept streaming across the mountains. In fact, so many people came that Daniel Boone felt his wilderness was being destroyed. It was no longer a wilderness land. He never gave up his love for the wilderness and continued to explore lands to the west of Kentucky until his death at the age of 86. That is our story for today. So, how were Daniel Boone and his friend John Finley, how are they able to cross the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky? They crossed the Appalachian Mountains through the Cumberland Gap using a Native American trail. What did Daniel Boone do in Kentucky? He hunted and trapped animals so that he could use them for food and clothes. What did Daniel Boone create that made it easier for the settlers to cross the Appalachian Mountains? He created the Wilderness Road, right? He widened up that footpath so that wagons could get through it. How did he make the Wilderness Road? He widened the footpath, but he had to have lots of help, right? He hired men to help him, and they cut down some trees to make the path wider. Okay. Why was the Wilderness Road important? What was so important about it? It was important because it allowed many more people to travel across the Appalachian Mountains to Kentucky and to settle there. The road made it easier to transport supplies and easier for families to travel in their wagons. In the read aloud you heard, these pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. Say the word pioneers with me. Pioneers. Pioneers are the first people who live in a new place. Pioneers often lead the way for others to follow. Many books have been written about pioneers settling in the western part of the United States. Okay. The cat is on the computer. Hang on, guys. Stop it. Okay. I'm going to read some activities that people might do. If it sounds like something that Daniel Boone and other pioneers might have done, I want you to say, pioneers would have done that. If it sounds like something that Daniel Boone and other pioneers would not have done, I want you to say, pioneers would not have done that. Okay, remembering that pioneers are the first people to live in a new place. They often lead the way for others to follow. Traveling long distances. Pioneers would have done that. What about building fires to keep people warm? Pioneers probably would have done that too. How about staying and settling in a big city? They wouldn't have done that because that means that there were already people living there. So that's not being the first people to live in a new place. How about shooting wild birds for dinner? Yeah, pioneers probably would have done that. How about building new log cabins in the wilderness? Yeah, they probably would have done that too. All right. Did we describe the challenges of crossing the Appalachian Mountains? Yep. Did we describe Daniel Boone's adventures? Did we demonstrate an understanding of the word pioneers? And then for your Nearpod activity, you are going to use a graphic organizer to analyze the actions of Daniel Boone. All right, friends, I will see you next time. Bye.